funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.
In June 1922, an overwhelming majority of people in what was to become the Irish Free State voted for candidates in favour of the Compromise Anglo-Irish Treaty, preferring a flawed peace and limited freedom rather than continued war with Britain. Despite this democratic mandate, many anti-treaty Republicans sought to defy and destroy the treaty and the new Irish state. Eventually things came to a head when anti-treaty rebels occupied Dublin's Four Courts and refused to leave. Now, if the new democratically elected Irish government wasn't able to remove them, then it was doomed. The man the government turned to for help was Emmet Dalton. In late June 1922 he began the attack on the Four Courts. Sean Boyne, historian and also author of the book Emmet Dalton, Somme Soldier, Irish General, Film, Pioneer.
We're here today at the corner of Wine Tavern Street, where Christchurch is located, and the Liffey Quays, and it was from this point that the artillery controlled by Major General Emmet Dalton bombarded the Four Courts just across the river.
This would have been June 28, 1922, if I'm correct, Sean.
That's right, 28th of June 1922, and it's generally seen as the start of the Irish Civil War.
And eventually, over a 3-day period, Emmet Dalton helped to oversee the National Army capture of the Four Courts, and in so doing helped safeguard Irish democracy. However, his ultimate service to his country was his successful amphibious landing of Free State forces into Cork a few weeks later in August 1922. An operation which helped to break the back of the so-called Munster Republic, the term used to describe the territory then held by anti-treaty Republicans in Munster. Sean Boyne.
In August 1922, the last big stronghold of the anti-treaty Republicans was Cork City and County, and they had blocked roads, they had disrupted railways, so it would have been difficult to advance by road. So Dalton agreed with Collins and with General Mulcahy. Dalton was a major advocate of this, that the best way to capture Cork was to approach by sea.
An amphibious landing.
An amphibious landing, and it was the most significant amphibious landing of the Irish Civil War. I suppose it could be seen as a mini version of the Dday landing, as you could say. He had 4 ships and about 800 men, and they landed at different points on the coast. They then advanced on Cork. Fighting took place en route, and sadly young men on both sides were killed. But he captured Cork, and this meant that the Republicans lost their last major stronghold.
Through his military genius, bravery and selfless service to his country, Emmet Dalton helped to defeat the state's enemies, save the infant Irish democracy, as well as help shorten the Irish Civil War and thus save countless lives. This is Emmet Dalton's story.
Emmet Dalton's a fascinating character.
He is vital in the winning of the Civil War, in the sense that without the taking of Cork, the Civil War could not have been won.
Dalton came in and crushed the Munster Republic and was able to bring about a rapid change in the military situation that almost certainly led to a different outcome in terms of the Civil War.
The boldness of it took the anti-treaty guys by surprise, and it turned out very well for Emmet Dalton and for the other pro-treaty commanders. It needn't have. It could have gone very badly wrong.
Within about a week of the landing, the Munster Republic was no more. What you would call the IRA field army had dispersed.
It was a huge military victory and masterminded by Emmet Dalton when they came in at the Cork landings.
His importance is basically winning the war for the pro-treaty side.
before we delve further into Emmet Dalton's military exploits, first we need to investigate his roots. John Dorney, historian of modern Irish history and also author of the book Peace After the Final Battle, the story of the Irish Revolution.
Emmet Dalton, like quite a number of nationalist revolutionaries in Dublin, came from the north side suburbs from Drumcondra. From a Catholic nationalist background, his father had been a nationalist in America, had come back to Ireland. Like a lot of his generation of kind of middle class people, he'd gone to a Christian Brothers school, O'Connell School, which many Republicans of that generation came from. His brother Charlie, Ernie O'Malley, quite a few others. The family, as I said, was nationalist. Emmet joined the Volunteers when they were first formed in 1913. And his father was a supporter of the Parliamentary Party.
And shortly after the First World War broke out in August 1914, John Redmond, the leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, urged Irishmen to join the British Army and fight for the rights of small nations such as Catholic Belgium. Sean Boyne.
Young Emmet, without the knowledge of his parents, joined the British Army. He joined the Royal Dublin Fusiliers as a trainee lieutenant without telling his parents, and the first they knew of it was when he came home to his home at 8 Upper St Columbus Road, Drumcondra, in the uniform of the British Army, and his father was outraged and his mother was very worried as well, but he managed to calm them down and they ultimately accepted his decision.
He's an Irish nationalist who enlists in the British Army and in the British Army officer class. And that was unusual. Certainly in the pre-war days, the officer class was almost, by definition, unionist to a man. He's joining up while he's still a teenager.
Dr. Gabriel O'Doherty, college lecturer in the School of History, University College, Cork. During Emmet Dalton's period of army training in Cork, the 1916 Easter Rising occurred. So what was his initial reaction to it? Dr. Brian Hughes, historian of modern Irish history in Maynooth University, and also author of the O'Brien Press 16 Lives biography of the 1916 rebel, Michael Mallon.
Dalton was in a camp in Cork at the time of the Easter Rising, when the Easter Rising broke out, and he said years later that his reaction was like those of his colleagues. It was shock, but also a certain amount of anger. They felt that it was foolish, it was a misguided enterprise, that, you know, they were the ones who were fighting for the nationalist cause, who were fighting for Ireland, and in many ways it was like a stab in the back. He felt that, you know, there might have been a certain amount of sympathy with the cause, but really no sense that, well, this was a good idea.
So then he was sent to France, and the British Army had a need for these young men to take the places of others who had been killed. And in September, he was transferred from the 7th Battalion of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers to the 9th Battalion. And he was delighted to meet among the officers there a man whom he knew very well, was a great friend of his father, Tom Kettle, who had been to O'Connell schools, also a former Edmund Out MP, who had become a professor in UCD. And so they were preparing for an attack on Ginchy.
And that attack on the village of Ginchy in September 1916, which Emmet Dalton and his friend Tom Kettle were involved in, was part of the much larger Battle of the Somme, which witnessed over 1 million casualties. John Dorney.
By the time Dalton was fed into the front in 1916, what you're looking at is a battle of attrition in that particular front between the British and the Germans. And some 70% of the casualties were caused by shell fire. Now, the reason for this is, as we know, by that point, the Western Front in the First World War was trench warfare, where, you know, it's really like an enormous siege. But what this means is that both sides have entrenchments, they're fortifications basically, and they can assemble vast quantities of artillery, and they're shelling each other. So what Dalton would have experienced above all is these horrendous artillery bombardments. People were killed in industrial quantities.
The Somme is a really horrific place to be. When you're not being fired at, you're in a trench, you could be up to your knees or ankles in water, rats, lice. You know, you can't change your uniform regularly. Things like trench foot are a real problem. And that's even before you face a machine gun.
And when the attack on Ginchy eventually occurred, Emmet Dalton saw many of his comrades killed in action, including Tom Kettle. Sean Boyne.
Kettle was advancing just in front of Dalton when Kettle was hit, and he died in front of Doyle, and Dalton was with him as he died. And this must have been a very traumatic moment for this teenaged officer. I think he was 18. He lied about his age in order to join up. So this was a most traumatic event for Dalton, and Dalton himself was slightly wounded. At the end of the fighting, there was only, I think, 2 officers left, himself and another officer a young officer from County Cork. And so for his actions that day, Dalton proved to be an extremely brave young man, and he was awarded the Military Cross for bravery for his actions on that day.
Dalton really was someone who saw the worst of the First World War.
Emmet Dalton would have seen a hellish battle, the like of which we can barely imagine.
It must have been a horrific experience for a young man from quite a sheltered background in Ireland to experience the bloodshed and the carnage.
However, aside from the slaughter which the young Emmet Dalton witnessed, he also gained much invaluable experience in soldiering, military tactics and strategy. Brian Hughes.
Dalton would have gained a lot of very valuable military experience. I mean, he had quite a range of experience as well. So he's on the Western Front, he's at the Somme, but he's also in Palestine doing reconnaissance or doing intelligence work. So he has a temporary commission as well, so he's commanding men. So this is the kind of thing that it was hard-won experience, hard-earned experience.
In the Middle Eastern theatre, in the Palestine theatre, he was involved in the sniper school, the musketry school, training and logistics. But actually, these are the sinews of military. So actually, it's very important for his subsequent career in Ireland that he knew how to do things like logistics, training, intelligence, how to organise a regular army. It's actually most important for what happened later to him in Ireland.
John Dorney. Emmet Dalton survived the slaughter of the Great War and eventually returned to Ireland in April 1919, after he was demobbed from the British Army. So what kind of Ireland was he returning to? Sean Boyne.
Ireland had changed. The 1916 rebellion had had a major influence on Irish life. The party that his father supported, I'm sure that he supported too, the Irish Parliamentary Party, had been destroyed essentially in the 1918 elections, and the Republican movement was now poised to mount a campaign for independence, and the Redmondite approach had been overshadowed. And so his younger brother Charlie had become involved in the volunteers, and he was working in the intelligence area, which was led by Michael Collins. And Dalton himself had developed sympathies with the Republican movement at this stage.
And it was perhaps inevitable, given his brother Charlie's strong Republican connections, as well as his rich wealth of military experience, that Emmet Dalton soon came to the attention of Michael Collins. Shortly after joining the IRA volunteers, Emmet Dalton was made Assistant Director of Training. Gabriel O'Doherty.
As Assistant Director of Training, his remit was to try and improve the overall standards of the volunteers in Dublin and also outside of Dublin. And of course this makes sense because he had been an officer in the British Army. He'd been used to commanding troops and to instilling a certain sense of discipline in those. He was also perhaps most useful in this respect in training the officers, the IRA officers, as to what would be expected from them in terms of leadership, in terms of courage, in terms of dash, in terms of initiative. So from that point of view, he did find a very appropriate niche for his talents and his experience.
He would have had a small staff. He created a few training manuals. He also would have been involved in conducting training camps to kind of teach IRA officers different aspects of weapons and military tactics.
Dr. John Organovo, college lecturer in the School of History, University College, Cork.
But then probably Dalton's most famous activity and the member of the IRA in the War of Independence was this Mountjoy prison break, the attempt to rescue Sean McKeown from military custody in Mountjoy prison. And in that we really see Dalton's his mettle and his coolness under fire. Basically, Sean McKeown was a senior IRA officer from Longford. He had been captured and was sentenced to death, and the IRA expected him to be hung. So Michael Collins made a special effort to rescue him before that happened. What's known as the Squad, guys closely associated with Michael Collins, had become aware of a British Army armored car that had a regular routine. I think they were collecting bread, and they basically made plans to ambush this armored car, seize it, disguise IRA members as British soldiers, go into the prison to Mountjoy with forged orders, and then get the release of McKeown and drive outside of Mountjoy. Quite audacious, quite kind of breathtaking in its boldness. And the man they chose to lead the operation was Emmet Dalton, who was dressed in his as a military officer. I believe it's kind of either as a major in his own uniform, who knew how to act the part, who also knew how to command men under fire. So the operation went forward. They were able to seize the armored car, go into the prison. Dalton and another colleague went inside the prison. The warden's office asked for McKeown to be delivered, but there was a kind of a confusion about that. And in the midst of all this, a firefight erupted, and they had to shoot their way out. And Dalton apparently was cool as a cucumber, with this kind of dropped his cigarette and pulled out his revolver. They hopped on the car and they drove out shooting and escaped. They didn't facilitate the rescue. They didn't rescue McKeown, but it was still seen as a lightning stroke, and it really shocked the British government, and it really captured the imagination of people inside of Ireland and outside of Ireland, because you can't think of a bolder operation than going right into the enemy's headquarters and trying to come back out again. And so that's pretty much what made Dalton's name, at least within IRA circles.
Collins was extremely grateful for the effort that had been made, and he was very impressed by Dalton's performance. And Dalton said later that Collins told him that he would always regard it as a successful failure.
Historian Sean Boyne. Here's John Organovo once again.
He seems to have struck up a strong friendship with Michael Collins. Collins would have seen in him someone who was educated, who was good fun, who could get along, who was flexible, but who also had this very significant military experience. And Collins began to rely on him, and they seem to have collaborated quite closely.
In July 1921, a truce was agreed between the British government and Irish Republicans. Shortly afterwards, Emmet Dalton was appointed IRA liaison officer with the British to try and ensure that the terms of the truce were maintained by each side. Now, when Michael Collins went to London in October 1921 as part of the Irish peace delegation, Emmet Dalton accompanied him as part of his security detail and also as an advisor on defence matters. Here's Gerard O'Connell, Secretary of the Collins 22 Society, which seeks to commemorate the life and principles of General Michael Collins.
In 1921, when he moves to London for the treaty negotiations, Dalton is one of the key people that's around Collins, ostensibly as a bodyguard, but also as an advisor to Collins during the talks. And it's a mark of the respect and esteem that Dalton was held in by Collins, that he was entrusted into Collins's inner circle, if you like, by 1921. He's well within Collins's inner circle.
And on the 6th of December 1921, Michael Collins and the other principal Irish peace delegates signed the controversial Anglo-Irish Treaty, which granted limited freedom to Ireland in the form of a new Irish Free State, not an Irish Republic. So what was Dalton's attitude to the treaty? Sean Boyne.
Dalton was always very supportive of Collins. He denied later that Collins had signed a treaty under duress. He said that wasn't the case. He said that Collins signed because it was the right thing to do and because they had achieved more than they had hoped to achieve. Certainly that was Dalton's view as he expressed in later life.
He was a Collins man, he was a Collins loyalist. But he was also somebody who, as a result of his British Army experience, knew that if the British Army had to go back to war, or did go back to war in Ireland, it could do even worse than it had already done. He knew this because he'd been in the British Army and he'd seen just what firepower the British Army could deploy should it choose to do so, or if it was deemed politically appropriate to do so. So for these factors, partly because out of instinctive loyalty, but also out of a sense of realism, that somebody who had knowledge of both the British Army and the IRA, he took the view, as Collins did, that the treaty, while by no means being the ideal, gave enough of independence to be going on with.
In a nutshell, Dalton felt that a flawed peace was preferable to a renewal of war with Britain on a scale hitherto unseen in Ireland. In contrast, a significant number of Irish Republicans vehemently opposed the Compromise Treaty and refused to allow the pro-treaty government to function. As a result, many anti-treaty Republicans occupied Dublin's Four Courts and refused to leave. Historian Brian Hughes.
The anti-treaty Republicans decide to occupy the Four Courts in opposition to the treaty. For them, I think for many of them, I suppose, it's a return to that idea that they're defending the Republic. So it's not all that unlike 1916 in that way, and that's actually kind of the rhetoric that some of the anti-treatyites use. Once again, we're the ones occupying the buildings, we're defending the Republic against an attack. So this is what they're doing, they're occupying this building, this is their act of defiance against a treaty that they disagree with. From the point of view of the provisional government, this is a huge, huge threat.
The issue came to a head in June 1922. The pro-treaty government had won a victory in the 1922 general election in June, which again widely supported the pro-treaty party. The British government were demanding the provisional government do something to disarm this anti-treaty IRA that was then occupying parts of Dublin and most of the rest of the country. And the issue came to a head after IRA members in London assassinated a senior British Army official, Field Marshal Henry Wilson.
Historian John Organovo of University College Cork. Here's James Durney, County Kildare historian in residence and also author of the book The Civil War in Kildare.
It's not only the fact that Wilson had been assassinated in London, but all around the country, anti-treaty IRA men are attacking British troops as they're leaving, as they're retreating, as they're demobilising from barracks and that and working their way back towards Dublin. They're coming under constant attack as well. There's a shooting dead of an officer in Kildare town in February 1922. There's a few other incidents as well. A couple of officers shot, attacked. And Churchill is getting sick and tired of this, and he lays down the law that something has to be done. And then you have this huge garrison in the middle of the city of Dublin doing what they like. Some of the men were involved in robbing banks in the area and that to fund the anti-treaty forces and that.
The other thing that the Four Courts garrison was doing, they assassinated 4 British soldiers in Dublin. Just remember, there's still a 6,000 strong British garrison in Dublin.
Historian John Dorney.
And Liam Mellows, apparently working with a guy called Patrick Lamb in the Dublin Brigade, seems to have been involved in shooting British soldiers to try to provoke them into attacking the IRA with the hope that this would collapse the treaty settlement. So, from the provisional government point of view, there's nothing good about this Four Court situation.
In the middle of the city, being under enemy hands.
The people in the Four Courts were a destabilising factor. It's a really serious challenge to the provisional government's authority.
The government itself felt in a very vulnerable situation.
At this stage, there's 2 rival Irish armies trying to take over.
And it just can't be allowed to develop any further. And the provisional government's hand is eventually forced.
And by this stage in late June 1922, Emmet Dalton had been promoted to Major General in the new pro-treaty Irish National Army. Also, he'd spent the previous few months helping to build up and organise that army. It was now clear to all that if the insurgents couldn't be removed from the Four Courts, then the emerging Irish Free State would likely perish. The new government was in a major fix and turned to Emmet Dalton for help. Sean Boyne.
It fell to him to procure the artillery from the British to launch the attack on the forecourts, where the anti-treaty forces had established their base. This was effectively the start of the Civil War.
The provisional government actually showed their hand and attacked the forecourts, and the Civil War erupts from then.
Strong, decisive action by the provisional government to win out. And Dalton was very much part of this tip of the spear of the military side of that.
Historian John Organovo.
One of the key advantages the National Army had was the presence of small field artillery pieces that had been loaned to them by the British Army. So these were able to shell the forecourts at very close quarters, just right across the river. And apparently at one stage, these are kind of tricky guns to operate. And apparently at one stage, Emmet Dalton kind of came in and actually took over kind of firing the gun almost single-handedly because, there was confusion about loading and reloading. And he basically was kind of overseeing the assault. He wasn't leading the assault, but he was kind of overseeing kind of the general plans around this, and kind of this conventional phase of fighting in Dublin, which was very much something he would have been more familiar with coming from a conventional army background.
Dalton's massive experience in the First World War with weapons and with artillery pieces was very important to him to be down there at the forecourts. Himself and another guy called Tony Lawler, who was a captain in Athlone at the time, he had fought in the First World War as well. So Dalton had called on him.
Ronny Daly of the Collins 22 Society, and also a former member of the Irish Defence Forces.
The guns, Dalton took charge of them down at the forecourts. It was down to Dalton, who had the military experience from the First World War, to use the guns, how to use the guns. As you know, when they got the guns at first, they were very inexperienced with them. Actually, they didn't dig them into the road, and on the recoil on them, some of them were injured. But Dalton brought in a Captain Tony Lawler, who had fought in the First World War from Athlone, and himself and Dalton controlled the guns to fire on the forecourt. Again, as you can see, Dalton's experience came into it there again. And every photograph you see of Dalton in military uniform is perfect. He's pristine because he's trained for that.
We know that what they were using were shrapnel shells and that, not really great against a fortified position, a concrete position.
Historian James Durney.
But again, you have to have able-bodied men behind the guns as well to be able to fire them as well. The fact that they're armed by the British with the artillery and with Lee Enfield rifles and all that, it's quite crucial that they know what they're doing.
They realised that Collins, Dalton, Mulcahy, the main generals in the Free State, and realised that they weren't going to have it under 1916. It wasn't going to drag it out and get sympathy from the rest of the public. So they had to finish this quick. They borrowed the guns from General Macready, who had put them under pressure, of course, as you know, because of the Chief of the Imperial Staff, Sir Henry Wilson, being assassinated in London. So they wanted to finish this quick. And the way to finish it was borrow guns from the British. Dalton used them.
Ronny Daly. Here's historian Gabriel O'Doherty.
This is the most serious outbreak of violence on this scale since Easter week. I mean, those artillery pieces can hit targets miles away. So they're firing, in effect, from their point of view, at point-blank range. I mean, they're firing literally across the Liffey. You could nearly throw a shell across, never mind have it from one of these very powerful artillery pieces. So from the point of view of those who were inside the forecourts, it was hell. I mean, having entrenched themselves in the forecourts from the point of view of protect themselves against a conventional attack, the problem then becomes is that they in effect have sealed themselves in, and it becomes very difficult for them to escape.
Yeah, they're inside. They don't, they've no escape plan. They don't know what they're going to do. They're not really expecting to be attacked by artillery, of course, because they know that the National Army don't have them. We're very surprised then when artillery arrives, supplied by the British forces in Ireland and that. And this is crucial as well, to be under artillery fire in your own city by your former comrades, and that has to have a demoralising effect on the men that are inside. No way out then as well. They have no real way out. There's no way of linking up with other troops in the general Dublin area.
James Durney. Here's Sean Boyne.
The siege went on for about 3 days, and ultimately the occupants surrendered. And at one stage, the Free Staters, they made breaches in the walls with the artillery. They broke in and the Republicans retreated to the rear of the complex. So ultimately they surrendered.
And key to that surrender and the National Army's Four Courts victory was Emmet Dalton's skills in parleying with the British in order to convince them of the National Army's bona fides, as well as its urgent need for secret aid, in particular field guns. John Organovo.
The British military leaders didn't have much respect for the IRA. They considered them a lower form of animal. They considered them kind of, when you read kind of their accounts, they were inferior socially. They considered them inferior intellectually. They also kind of considered them inferior racially. And also the form of warfare they practiced, guerrilla warfare, the British Army considered that to be kind of treacherous, not brave, cowardly, and also even feminine, that you see some of these accounts. So it was important for them to meet somebody and deal with somebody who they could respect, who they saw as one of their own. So here you have Dalton, a highly decorated British Army officer who speaks like they do, who walks like they do, who is well-mannered and well-heeled, who is urbane, and you got to think that must have had a psychological impact on them in order to build up trust between the two sides, because that trust was really key at the critical moment around the Four Courts.
The Four Courts bombardment and the subsequent battle around it ended the Civil War in Dublin.
It decapitated the Republican leadership. Much of the IRA executive was inside the Four Courts, so they lost their leadership.
Regarding the fall of the Four Courts, Emmet Dalton is very important, purely for the fact that he gets and commands the artillery, which enabled them to take the Four Courts.
The seizure of the Four Courts was a highly critical moment in terms of the formation of the new Irish Free State, and Dalton played a key role in that.
And after the Four Courts victory, Emmet Dalton was put in charge of Eastern Command, restoring peace and order in much of the east of Ireland. John Organovo.
Dalton, he led forces that consolidated the provisional government's position. He moved down into kind of south, into Wexford, into kind of Kildare and all those areas, clearing Republican forces and keeping kind of small mobile forces, acting decisively with kind of a grander strategy to create a whole buffer zone around Dublin in order to protect the seat of government. And from that seat of government, the provisional government was able to go out and take on piecemeal and start attacking these Republican citadels all around the country.
With the strongest anti-treaty Republican citadel being Cork City in the so-called Munster Republic, the term used to describe the territory then held by anti-treaty Republicans in Munster, in particular Cork. Dr. Gabriel O'Doherty of the School of History, University College, Cork.
Cork couldn't have been allowed to remain in the hands of the anti-treatyites. It's as simple as that. If the government wished to demonstrate that it was a government that had jurisdiction over the entire country, you couldn't allow the second city in that state to be under the control of the enemies of that state, especially as it was such a major port. And again, remember that the British were just down the road in Cove. So if the Republicans had been allowed to remain in control of the city, it would have been a humiliation for the government, and it would have been much more dangerous than simply a humiliation, because it could have been used, the Republicans, as a jumping off point to try and reconquer the land that had been lost. So from a government point of view, it wasn't a question of whether or if you were going to take Cork, it was a question of when and how.
And realising that a frontal attack by land on Cork would lead to a protracted and bloody land war, Emmet Dalton suggested to his Commander-in-Chief Michael Collins that a series of amphibious landings should secure a speedy victory with minimal casualties. Sean Boyne.
It was decided that the best way to attack would be by sea. So essentially Dalton led this expeditionary force of about 800 soldiers. They were in 4 ships. One ship went in at Youghal in East County Cork. Another ship went in at West Cork at Union Hall and landed troops, and then his own main force, which he was leading himself, went in 2 ships. He was in the Arvonia to Patriot West.
There are some parts of the country which were barely touched by the Civil War, but you were definitely going into the heat of the battle in that particular part of Munster, Cork.
Militarily, the amphibious landings in Cork were critical.
This is Emmet Dalton's big brainwave, and in a way this is the move that kind of decides the Irish Civil War from a military point of view.
It's very daring. There is a danger, of course, is if you have lots of men on board a ship. The danger, of course, is that if that ship somehow was sunk, you could lose an awful lot of men in one go.
Historian Gabriel O'Doherty.
There was also the danger that if you're not able to get them off the ship very quickly, they could be sitting ducks. So in a very well thought out, very daring manoeuvre, in effect, large numbers of troops are taken on board a ship which is disguised. It's very similar to another ship which has just left passage, which the anti-treatyites allow to go out through the boom. And then this ship returns, and it seems to the anti-treatyites that this ship has perhaps experienced some mechanical difficulties. So the ship docks at passage, and almost immediately the hatches are thrown open, and the troops get out, and you start firing. Sort of very dramatic engagement. And so they're able to get ashore.
His invasion of Cork, you could call it our mini equivalent of the Dday landings, 800 men in 4 ships.
It was quite an imaginative and a bold stroke that he pulled off quite well.
To land troops on the coast behind enemy lines as a means of turning the flanks of the anti-treaty IRA and to force them back.
Dalton's force met the most stubborn resistance.
Historian John Organovo of University College Cork.
He was able to kind of get off the docks and move overland, but the road network had been cut and he was kind of pinned on one road, and the Republicans were able to pull off a number of their forces from different areas and flood them into the area. So you probably had at one point about 200 to 300 IRA fighters facing about 400 of Dalton's forces.
This is the so-called Battle of Rochestown.
This is the battle. It's called the battle. And so this would be called, some people call it the Battle of Douglas, some people call it the Battle of Rochestown. I guess it's from whatever side of the hill you're from. I call it the Battle for Cork. And it was basically a 3-day fight between the National Army and the Republican forces. And you would have had probably 600 or 700 folks engaged combined. There was a whole lot of shooting. Probably somewhere along the line of maybe 20 all told killed, but you probably would have had 50 or 60 wounded. So, you're talking about 80 people killed or wounded. That's not insignificant. Artillery was used. There were ships being used as well. You had an airplane kind of buzzing about, kind of strafing folks up in Middleton. You had armored cars, a Republican armored car kind of facing pro-treaty armored cars. So a lot of elements of modern warfare in this one little area.
They now have a very difficult task because it's a very difficult terrain. For those who know the approach from terrain through Monkstown, Rochestown Passage in Cork, you have very high ground to the land side and you have the sea to the right side. So you have to fight on a very narrow front, or you have to try and fight uphill to try and get over the hill to get round the Republicans. And of course this is very, very difficult to do. So it takes days for the forces to fight inch by inch along the coast road, but also by taking a number of flanking manoeuvres over the crest of the hill to try and get round the back of the Republicans, perhaps coming into Douglas. So the Republicans fight a fighting retreat through Rochestown, by the monastery there, and back into Douglas. And it's then that the resistance is broken and they go back into Cork City, and then, in effect, the anti-treaty IRA retreat along the Western Road out to West Cork, trying to destroy as much as they can of the infrastructure as they go along. So, for example, they burn Collins Barracks to try and deny the pro-treaty forces, the National Army, use of the barracks when they arrive in the city.
Historian Gabriel O'Doherty. Here's John Organovo.
When you read about Dalton's offensive in Cork, we always think about these landings. It was in a bold stroke that he pulled off quite well. But it's how he followed up, which really kind of shows the mark of the man as a military leader. He basically formed small, powerful formations of maybe 100, 150 soldiers with armored cars, with a lot of transportation to move fast. And he basically pushed them out into different directions across Cork to harass and keep pressure on the Republican forces so that they weren't able to reorganize and counterattack. And basically by keeping a lot of pressure and kind of upping the tempo, he was able to keep them on the back foot. Even though this was an area where they were strong, where they knew the local ground, he was able to harass them to such an extent that they disbanded their forces. And so within about a week of the landing, the Munster Republic was no more. What you would call the IRA field army had dispersed.
So just how innovative was Emmet Dalton's taking of Cork? James Durney.
Strategically, it's probably the best move in that whole period. Between 1916 to 23, it's the best strategic move that once and for all, comes in behind the Republican troops, lands in their rear as such. And it's like MacArthur's move in 1950, September 1950, when he lands his army at Inchon behind the advance on North Korea.
This would have been during the Korean War.
This is during the Korean War in 1950-53. And the UN troops are under fierce pressure at Busan. But MacArthur lands his troops miles and miles away at Inchon and cuts off the North Koreans from their supply route from the north. And it effectively ends that first phase of the Korean War. Dalton's move in 1922 in the rear of the Munster Republic is virtually the same, and it destroys the Republican forces in the field because he attacks from where they're least expected, lands in their rear with hundreds of troops, including artillery in that as well. So it's a hugely strategic move, very, very well played out and very well thought of by Emmet Dalton.
Dalton had a sophisticated, multi-armed version of modern warfare that none of the National Army officers would have had. He was a critical military strategist and voice in this new army, and it's hard to envision at least the opening phase of the Civil War going as smoothly for the Free State had Dalton not been there.
Nobody had envisioned taking a coastal landing and coming from behind the anti-treaty forces from behind. The anti-treaty forces, if you like, were waiting to come in on land, and it would have been a massive loss of life. So it was a huge, if you like, military victory, and masterminded by Emmet Dalton when they came in on the Cork landings.
James Langdon of the Collins 22 Society. Here is James Langdon's Collins 22 Society colleagues Ronny Daly and Paul Callery.
It saved an awful lot of lives, if you look on both sides. If you think of the consequences if they had went down, because Munster was a huge Republican stronghold, and they were prepared for, if you like, the Free State Army to come down via land.
Both myself, Ronnie, and Jim have military experience, and nothing adds to anything like morale or a morale booster. So, in the sense of, as we said earlier on, a lot of lives being saved. This was a great boost to the National Army at the time, that they were able to go in and successfully take on one of the biggest Republican counties. So it was a massive boost for the army, and again a massive boost probably for Dalton, knowing that here we are, we're saving lives, or we're trying to save lives in trying to get back the Free State.
I've spent over 42 years in the military. Paul has spent over 26 years in the army, and James was also in the reserve forces. And we know from military experience, I would travel overseas any time with a leader that I know that I could trust in. Fellas looked at Dalton and said, he has military experience from the First World War. Collins made him a general, so they'd follow him. They would feel confident going on the ships down to Cork to do the Cork landings. And that's why Collins put Dalton in charge of Munster.
And once Cork was captured by Emmet Dalton's National Army Expeditionary Force, many people thought that the Irish Civil War would soon be over, since the anti-treaty conventional army had been soundly defeated. Unfortunately, instead, the war continued, with anti-treaty Republicans resorting to guerrilla tactics. John Organovo.
It seemed like the war was over. There was a lot of public pressure to end the hostilities. The Republicans were demoralized by their 6-week defeat, and the National Army seems to have assumed that this would end the hostilities. Michael Collins came down to Cork to visit, to probably see to some financial matters, to see some Republican funds. And during that period, he decided to go tour West Cork with Dalton and to visit some of the new garrisons, but also to visit some of those people, almost like a victory tour. But he unfortunately ran into Republicans who decided that rather than give up the fight, they would resume guerrilla warfare, which they excelled at. And one of these first guerrilla operations was an ambush of Michael Collins' convoy under the command of Emmet Dalton at a place called Bealnablath, about 12 miles from Cork City.
Once the attack on the convoy had started, certainly the story is that Dalton suggested, drive, let's get out of here immediately, let's not engage them, but Collins overruled that.
Historian Brian Hughes of Maynooth University.
Collins got out into the middle of the road, which really, probably he's broken a number of rules in terms of what the commanding officer in something like this should be doing. Collins is someone who doesn't have really very much military experience at all. Certainly he's in the GPO in 1916 as an aide-de-camp, but he isn't a man who has a whole lot of experience in this way, in the way that someone like Dalton would. So being in an ambush is a whole new experience for Collins. So really, it's probably bravado in terms of what he does. This idea of we'll stay and fight, we'll show them who's boss, and we'll show them who's in charge. And in Collins' case, it costs him his life. Maybe the wise thing to do would have been, again, one of these great counterfactuals in history. If they just taken Dalton's advice and hightailed out of there, how might Irish history have been? Very different. But we know that's not the case. Collins is actually the only casualty of the ambush, and it's something, I suppose, that's now one of the most iconic events in Irish history. Dalton is right there. Dalton's right at the very heart of it.
So what kind of impact did the death of Michael Collins have on Emmet Dalton? Gerard O'Connell of the Collins 22 Society.
I think it was the defining moment in Emmet Dalton's life. I don't think he ever recovered from it. I think it's a Dallas 1963 situation all over again. And I think anyone that has been through that, I think he was affected badly by it. And I don't think he was the same person otherwise.
He wasn't the first person Emmet Dalton had seen killed at close quarters. But, like many people, he did have this strange personal relationship with Collins. Collins brought him into the IRA, brought him into the inner circles of the IRA, and then brought him into the National Army. And also, Dalton was Collins' bodyguard in London during the treaty negotiations. So, he was very close to Michael Collins. And like I said, he hero-worshipped him. So the death of Michael Collins was a tremendous blow to him.
Historian John Durney. Here's Sean Boyne, author of the book Emmet Dalton, Some Soldier, Irish General, Film, Pioneer.
He was very embittered over the death of Collins, but he was also embittered over the casualties being inflicted on his own soldiers.
Those casualties resulting from increasing anti-treaty Republican guerrilla attacks on the National Army in Cork.
He possibly felt that at this stage there was no way back for the Republicans, that the war should finish, and that these deaths that were being inflicted were absolutely pointless. And he was so embittered that he actually lobbied for the death penalty to be imposed on Republicans who were captured in possession of weapons. But then when the government actually brought in such proposals, he seemed to have second thoughts.
However, while Emmet Dalton may have had second thoughts, many others didn't. After the death of Michael Collins, the Irish Civil War entered its most bitter and vicious phase, with each side violating the normal rules of war and committing many atrocities.
The Civil War is a very traumatic episode. Irishmen fighting Irishmen. People who were former colleagues turning on each other.
Both sides do things to the other that were never going to be forgotten.
Civil wars are terrible, you know. It's our brother fighting brother, cousin fighting cousin. They knew where each other's positions were, so they were able to raid each other's locations.
It's just a pathetic period of Irish history, the Civil War. Totally avoidable. Comrade taking on comrade, family split, community split. It poisoned Irish political life in this country for decades afterwards.
And perhaps overwhelmed by the tragic turn of events, in late 1922 Major General Emmet Dalton resigned from the National Army. He was just 24 years of age at the time. Sean Boyne.
He resigned from the army around November, but he stayed in his post for a period until December. And for many years he refused to say why he resigned from the army. And even in 1970 he was asked and refused to say. Finally he broke his silence and he indicated essentially he had no stomach for executing prisoners and decided to resign. Dalton was a truthful man, and if he says he resigned because of his concern over the death sentence that he might be required to impose, I would tend to believe him. There may have been other factors. So he resigned.
There's mystery about why he left the National Army. He was, I would argue, in this opening phase of the Civil War, he is the single most important military leader on either side. And he's definitely the most successful. He does a great job building up the National Army, and he is a superb field commander. He's the best field commander on either side.
Historian John Organovo.
He got a job in the Doyle as a secretary of the Doyle, which was a pretty sweet, cushy number, which would have been very much seen as kind of reward for his battlefield exploits. Yet he was unhappy there, and he didn't settle to it, and he left. He seems to have been drinking heavily.
With perhaps the cause of Emmet Dalton's heavy drinking being post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition of delayed trauma which many war veterans experience. James Durney.
If you look at the likes of Emmet Dalton, who had been fighting for maybe 7-8 years, it has to have a serious effect on you. To kill a human being has to have an effect on you at some stage. Some people are able to put it behind them, put it at the back of their mind, never think about it, maybe 50 years later. But it does affect it, post-traumatic stress.
It's hard to know if Dalton was affected by post-traumatic stress disorder.
Historian Sean Boyne.
Certainly at one period he was drinking very heavily, and Eunice O'Connor, who knew him well, believed that this was due to the strain of his military service, during which, for instance, he had witnessed the death of two friends, Tom Kettle and Michael Collins. And so certainly that was one view that was taken. As regards his drinking, Dalton was capable of great self-discipline, and it was causing problems in his life, and then he just stopped and never took a drink for the rest of his life.
And after quitting to drink in the early 1930s, Emmet Dalton became a responsible homemaker and wage earner for his family. Now at this stage many would reckon that he'd had enough excitement and adventures in his life, but not so. From the 1940s onwards he became more and more involved in the film business. As a result, in the late 1950s he helped to establish Ireland's first film studios. John Organovo.
People liked to trust Dalton. Dalton was considered trustworthy and credible. And he was able to leverage this for this tremendous undertaking, which was Ardmore Studios, which is kind of his big legacy in terms of modern Ireland. I mean, people who are interested in military history and the War of Independence think about him as this kind of military commander. But then people who are interested in, Sean Lemass's Ireland, kind of post-war Ireland, and really this film industry that we have. I mean, Emmet Dalton is really the father of Irish cinema to many extent. I mean, there had been a tradition of filmmaking here going back to the 20s, but really Emmet Dalton ushers in modern filmmaking in Ireland, and he sets up Ardmore Studios and really is the key figure at setting up what's going to become the Irish film industry.
With military precision, Major General Emmet Dalton died in Dublin on his 80th birthday on the 4th of March 1978. He was later buried at Glasnevin Cemetery, Dublin, with full military honours, not far from the grave of his old comrade-in-arms, Michael Collins. So what was Emmet Dalton's ultimate legacy, especially to his country? Ronny Daly of the Collins 22 Society.
To control a civil war in Dublin, to end the four courts after less than a week that it didn't drag out, to have the tactics to bring in heavy artillery to shell it. They didn't do that in 1916 for about 4 or 5 days into it, when the British eventually did bring artillery in and started using it on the GPO and buildings around Dublin. Dalton brought it in straight away before the Civil War even started. They got an ultimate, and then he started firing them on it with the 18-pounders from Wyntarburn Street and from Smithfield and that location. So he stopped the Civil War in that sense, finished it within a week. Then he moved on down to Munster, and straight in, the Langdon by ship. The Republicans were expected to come by road. They came in by sea. That was Dalton's thinking again, and that was all down to his military service in the First World War and seeing service in Egypt with the Leinster Regiment and the Dublin Fusiliers. And that was his greatest legacy. Controlling the Civil War, containing it to stop it spreading.
I think his ultimate legacy is the fact that the Civil War was brought to an end in a speedy manner, and that the democratic will of the Irish people was upheld.
Gerard O'Connell of the Collins 22 Society.
And the legacy of all these people is the same as far as I'm concerned. It comes a little bit after that period, 1932. You have a general election in this country, and Fianna Fáil are elected to power. And sworn enemies and people that were on one side of the political divide towards the other handed over power. And the peaceful handover of power and transition between Cumann na Gael, as it was then, and Fianna Fáil is the ultimate legacy. And the fact that we are able to sit in this country and settle our political differences through the ballot box, and we have an ability to hear the multi-layered voices of the Irish people through our civilian democratic government, I believe that's Emmet Dalton's greatest legacy, and it's a legacy he shares with many other members of that generation.
Funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.